like this. Rock and roll. Okay, brilliant. With great pleasure, Tom Dixon. Okay, finally. Okay, I spend much too much time on the internet, and it's usually a waste of time, but I came across this project along maybe 8 years ago, which was a 1970s visionary architect that had decided he was going to grow cities under the water and float them to the surface. And I thought, yeah, I'll try that. So he was called Wolf Hilberts, and he'd discovered a way of making natural cement by making metal frameworks and charging them with a very small amount of electricity, maybe 6 volts. And what would happen then would be that mineral salts dissolved in the seawater would be attracted to the metal framework. And just like you all do this at home, fur on your kettle, this is calcium carbonate in the main. So calcium carbonate is interesting because, in fact, we're probably in a limestone barn, right? So that's calcium carbonate, as is chalk, as is oyster shell, right? So it's, in fact, limestone is probably fossilized oyster shell. Anyway, so I decided I was going to have a go at this, and at the time I was trying to think of slightly more ecological ways of making furniture, and I decided I was going to make an underwater furniture factory. This was my plan. So I went to the Bahamas, as you do, and because this has to happen in warm water, not in cold water, mainly because the technique works faster in warm water. So here I am in the Bahamas. I've made my metal frameworks. Interestingly, they're made from concrete reinforcement rods, so maybe 8 millimeters of steel, which would be in cement anyway. And then I make my chairs, and I dump them in the water with this electrical charge. And I pull them out maybe 2 years later, so it's quite slow. Not very efficient way of making furniture. And they've accumulated this incrustation of calcium carbonate. So what was 8 millimeters before is now much more like 1 inch or 2 inches of natural cement. Actually reinforced cement because it's got the metal structure on the inside. So, I mean, this is all well and good, but it's not really the cleverest way to make furniture. As you pull out the chairs, you see you're destroying some marine life. There would have been sponges growing on this and barnacles growing on this. But what was more interesting about the technique was that Wolf Hilberts had discovered that you could graft concrete onto these structures, and the coral would grow back maybe 5 or 6 times faster than it might in nature. So it would appear that the electrical stimulus, which is electroplating the framework, is enhancing the growth of the coral, and because the coral isn't using its energy to make electricity, because all of these processes are micro-electrical processes, they're able to grow much faster as a result. So these are broken corals that have been taken off, that have been bashed by ship hulls or by tourism generally. And you can just stick them on a metal framework with a little piece of wire. And if this framework is electrified, they'll grow back and flourish in a way which is quite extraordinary. And you can see here, well, on one side there's a white paper describing the process. So it's documented and it works, but for some reason it sort of vanished. This is 1979. And you can see on the left-hand side, really after 4 or 5 years, maybe 20 centimeters of natural cement. So I think I sort of abandoned the project for a while, and then really started thinking about it a bit more recently. in terms of another angle, not so much making furniture underwater, but this time thinking about how you could scale up a project to really make it make sense, particularly in coral restoration. My observation with a lot of these projects that we've seen, and when I've gone and seen the coral reefs that are bleaching and dying, the kind of desert wasteland that we see, is that the scale of the problem is so huge that it's very hard for any of us to think of what we could do to make any impact. My conclusion was that you need to kind of follow the money. So, you know, where the money is really spent in coastal regions is definitely not in preserving nature, nor coral restoration, nor trying to regenerate the fisheries. It's spent on coastal erosion. So I'm going to maybe just skip through to another picture. So, you know, if you look at these kind of man-made structures that exist on the coast, where the coasts are rapidly being eroded, you know, partly through extreme weather events, partly through just natural processes, the man's solution to this is just to dump in a load of concrete. That not only is very expensive, it's very intrusive, and it destroys the marine life on the seabed. So this series of defences here in the UK might cost somewhere like £5,000 per metre to install. We're all paying for that. There's £1 billion a year spent in the UK alone on coastal defence, and that's going to get more as more extreme weather events start to exist. And the other thing is that, so £5,000 a metre makes 5 million a kilometre, right? Is that correct? My calculation, probably. So that's where real money is being spent on protecting the coastline. And the interesting thing about coral reefs is they're much, much better means of protecting from coastal erosion than these kind of defences. What happens is the wave force against these kind of structures just destroys them. It reflects the power of the waves back into the sea and often just pushes the problem downstream to the next beach or to the next coast, just down a few meters down from the defence. So where am I going with this? So I think that there's definitely something that can be done to fund this kind of project in a much bigger way. And my conclusion from the project was really that I needed to find a site that I could test out really the beach erosion part of this project whilst preserving the corals. So luckily I found a site in the Maldives this time. So Maldives have got a series of luxury hotels, and the luxury hotels desperately need, you know, the sea to be thriving and flourishing to attract tourism. So as a next step in the project, I'm going to head for a hotel in a couple of weeks, and I will there try and install a series of structures to test out a whole series of different theories. One which is to do, obviously, with coral regrowth. At this hotel that I'm visiting, they've got 10 scientists that are busy trying to identify heat-resistant corals, because in these wastelands which are currently being formed in places like Maldives, there's a few corals that manage to survive. And those corals are being selected, chopped up into small bits and bred to try and find a means of genetically enhancing the heat-resistant qualities of some corals. I'd be looking very carefully at what happens with the erosion, because that's where I think the real money is. But on top of that, there's all kinds of other potential benefits, including the increased growth of oysters and other shellfish. There's a carbon capture element, because it's calcium carbonate. And most importantly, this natural reinforced concrete substitute. I mean, cement is currently responsible for somewhere between 6 and 7% of carbon emissions globally anyway. So there's an urgent race to try and find substitutes for concrete just in general. But it's also increasingly a big problem with the sand that's used in making cement. I mean, anyone who's made cement will know that you need at least 2 bags of sharp sand, not desert sand, sharp sand, which is beach sand, to every bag of concrete. And that's rapidly vanishing as we speak. In fact, places like the Mekong Delta are now completely stripped of sand altogether. And that's the beaches that we know and love. And it's happening all over the world. So, and then on top of that, I think the other benefit would be that coastal communities in general require a thriving seabed to just survive. We've seen the seaweed collection, we know about fisheries, we know that tourism brings cash and encourages people to preserve the natural environment. So that's my plan. And I think what's kind of interesting with this site is that it's suffering from beach erosion, it's got the bleaching event, it's got some people that can help me do the welding, and they've proved the concept. So here's some structures that are already in there, which are showing in a full-year growth of a coral grafted onto the framework here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which really show how quickly the coral can regenerate in the right circumstances with a bit of stimulus. The other aspect of trying to find a way of scaling this, so I described the potential of where the money is being spent at the moment or misspent at the moment. But I think what's kind of interesting about this moment in time, and we've heard about it a bit from a couple of the speakers, which is to do with artificial intelligence. So the next couple of pictures I was going to show were really a bit more to do with that. So I've used AI to generate some imagery in this illustration here to try and show innovative structures, to try and show what happens when they've been in the sea for a while. But the idea of the small pilot I'm going to be creating in the Maldives is really so that we can feed data into a digital twin. For anybody that doesn't know digital twins, they're models of usually often used in architecture to predict what happens in the building. Let's say if the sun's particularly hot, to see what happens to the heat inside the building. So you can feed data into these models, and they come from the gaming industry. So they're quite compelling looking models, which are quite useful also as a marketing tool. So I think that the trick will be not just making pretty pictures like this, but trying to get people, whether those are governments or property developers, to actually invest in something that they can visualize, because it's quite hard underwater, as seen, to really make people imagine what could change for the better. They can be used to feed in data, so you can kind of see what might happen to a beach if you're trying to regenerate a beach, see what happens to a series of metal frameworks as they grow and as they evolve. And you can do that in real time. So you can click a button and say, well, what would this look like in 5 years' time? What might this look like if you increase the acidity level by a small amount? Or what happens when it gets a bit warmer? So the digital twin becomes really a mechanism for predicting, for marketing, but also for engineering, because you can use these digital twins also to cost up a project and also imagine its benefits from a variety of data inputs. So these are the kind of pictures that I'm starting to create now. Definitely with the intention of showing some of these structures first here at Messums in a few months' time, and seeing whether we can't even think about maybe selling some artworks where people invest in owning an artwork, not in their backyard, not in their collection, not in the storage facility, but in an exotic location where it's actually growing and benefiting the environment in some way. So this is one aspect, again, of kind of trying to kickstart enough financial backing from selling artwork. So, very much this idea that art and science and technology can work in tandem, then doing it in a place where they need to have a thriving and beautiful underwater environment with the intention of feeding it into a digital twin, making extraordinary imagery, and then selling the potential to much larger infrastructures, using money which is already being spent in a poor way to defend the coastline of all of these places which are suffering. And you've got to remember that tropical waters are suffering obviously faster than most others, particularly in places like the Maldives where the water is shallow. Those effects are really having an impact right now. Even tiny increases in water temperature have disastrous impacts. And then, with any luck, we should be in a position to see whether actually the original dream, which was to create cities underwater and float them to the surface, is actually a reality or was always a fantasy. So I think we will be able to lift these structures to the surface if we want, not that that's the intention. But this shows, potentially what we could show at Messums in 5 years' time. So that's roughly it, and I've kept it short because Johnny wanted some questions, and we're running late as well, right? Yeah, thanks.
Wonderful. Does anybody... Question right at the back here. I'll come to you. Please, there.
Hi there. Can you tell us a bit about the film you're making?
The movie?
Isn't there a film? Yeah, you're making a film.
No, she did the film.
No.
No, it's not a film. I mean, what's interesting about these digital twins is that they're really coming from the gaming industry. So the people that produce the architectural software, the people they're called Epic Games, and they produce software for or the platform for things like hang on, somebody give me a Fortnite. That's the one, the killing game, right? So all of these games have been mainly used for killing, and now they're being used for construction. And anybody who's played a computer or video game knows about this idea of doing things in real time and affecting your 3D model in real time. So the great thing about AI and the great thing about these gaming platforms, they allow you to visualize. And I think, one of the big problems is trying to visualize how we can scale up, what the potential impact of an investment might be, how quickly we can bring back the fish and the marine life. And the kind of interesting thing is that, because most of the information about these kind of projects sits in these kind of documents that haven't even been digitalized, so nobody has access to this unless you've got the time to, go deep into some very obscure websites, right? So I think you need, I think the struggle in my mind, or why you'd use art, or design for science is to try and get to a point where people can imagine a better world and see how it can be funded, right? And that's really been, like I say, my big struggle in terms of trying to understand what I could potentially do, is how you scale up to something which is really significant, rather than fiddle around at the edges, or as was described earlier, lots of people working in different silos. So what's great about these models is they allowed all kinds of inputs from different data sets, from different artists to exist within an environment that other people can chip into. Typically they're used for things like building Airbus, for instance, so that engineers can sit inside the plane and solve problems in a real-time environment. So they're that sophisticated that they can build aeroplanes with lots of teams around the world. The plane wings are made in Wales and the engines are made somewhere else. And so these models are used for collaborative scientific and engineering work anyway, but also for gaming, and more people are familiar with how they work and how to live in this digital environment. So it's not a film, it's more like a game, effectively.
take two questions.
I was just going to say, you know, they just look the perfect artwork to do as an FT, a frangible token, because
As a what, sorry?
as an FT, as a frangible token, so that people buy them, and then as they get, they're growing. So you could maybe have a film of it at year 1 and a film of it at year 4, but it's going to increase in value because it's increasing in size. And, you know, people buy FTs of trainers that don't actually exist, and they spend tens of thousands of pounds for an FT of a design of a trainer, whereas this is something that actually exists. And then you can monetize it because it's growing in its own right.
Maybe can I ask Johnny a question then, rather than Johnny asking, you know, moderating? Is that, well, do you think there is potential in selling futures, and do you think that, as you know, somebody that sells art, people would be interested in owning a sculpture that they don't necessarily have full-time access to?
That's what an FT is. They don't have them.
No, but this one exists rather than just being digital, right?
No, I think you've got two different things. You've got a digital token, and you've got a real.
I've got real things that you can only see if you are slightly anti-sustainable and fly to the Maldives.
Or you have a digital token on the wall that you see it mature.
Or you could do both.
So you see
could
it
be one
mature
thing.
like a trust
But
fund.
I think, I don't know. I mean, the answer might be, the aspiration is that, yeah, if you thought that it was going to do, yeah, it's a big scale. I don't know, it's a difficult question.
Bonkers is good.
I'm here to ask the difficult questions, okay?
Let's round out. I'll come back on that question, but I'll just take the last question here and then we'll round up.
What is the scale of these things compared to, say, an old steel boat that you sink in order to improve the fishing, you know, off somewhere out in Poole Bay or something? Yeah.
The scale right now has been 8 chairs and 2 tables, right? So tiny. The scale of ambition. I sold 4 of them so far. There's a couple left if anybody wants them. The scale of the test in the Maldives then becomes something which is probably an 1/8 of the size of this room. Think of a children's playground or something. So, you know, I put in maybe 6 structures that test out a variety of different theories: a lobster hotel, an oyster farm, a kelp forest, and a coral regeneration plant. So think of it like regenerative gardening or something, right? So I'll do it. It'll be the size of this, and I'll do that in 2 weeks in the Maldives. In the meantime, I should be able to start gathering data immediately, specifically on coral regrowth, because we'll graft some coral onto it, and also counting the number of fish that are coming back and inhabiting the reef, because that's what happens when you start growing fresh coral, is that other sea life comes along, and see whether lobsters or little crabs come along, like in your thing. So the scale of it is small, but the idea is to make the ambition big and to use the new tools of AI, which are effectively, you know, catalyst tools, and massive levers to increase the speed at which you can A, process the data, B, you know, produce visualizations, and C, convince people that this is a legitimate project, you know. So I think within a year, I should be able to come back and convince, you know, bigger companies, you know, bigger developers. There's a lot of projects around the world that need to be seen to be regenerating, like oil rigs, for instance, or, you know, that are being decommissioned. They've destroyed the sea, or wind farms where they're actually putting in big lumps of concrete in the sea and destroying, you know, bits of sea floor, and some money is there for actually repairing that, right? So there's quite a lot of projects. There's marinas in Saudi Arabia. There's, you know, all kinds of seabed which is currently being trawled or destroyed. And there is a need to restore that, a need to restore it for fisheries. There's definitely, even on the south coast here in the UK, it used to be thriving and teeming with oysters and mussels, and that's what people used to eat. Well, there's nothing anymore. And these oysters particularly are amazing facility for cleaning water, which is something that's needed as well, right? So, you know, if we can prove, so one of these white papers a bit earlier was to do with the same project, but in the harbour in New York, for instance, where they managed to do the same thing, which is to grow, is it that one? Oysters back in a place. Yeah, here we go. Electrical restoration of oysters and salt marsh at New York City estuary. So similar water temperatures to the UK, but here we're talking about oyster regrowth and salt marsh, which is an amazing environment for fish and also carbon capture. As we know in the Bahamas, they're actively growing marsh to absorb carbon as carbon offsets as well.
No. Tom, this, I think, is give you a very real... I come back to your question, which you answered, and say, Tom, thank you very, very much. I think it's a really interesting way of...